He didn't walk away from Honda. He detonated the past. One keystroke on a digital contract ended a dynasty that had carried him to legend and chained him there just as tightly. On that morning, the air in Cervera was cold enough to sting, yet his pulse burned like over-revving pistons. 25 million euros evaporated with the sound of a mouse click, and somewhere in Japan a server blinked, erasing the name that once rewrote gravity. What he chased wasn't rebellion. It was oxygen. Years of telemetry, surgery, and politics had reduced a rider into a system, and Marc Márquez decided to crash that system by choice. He loaded a van with silence, left the empire of orange and chrome behind, and followed a road that smelled of rain, diesel, and freedom. Every kilometer toward Faenza was a downshift into uncertainty. Ducati wasn't a guarantee, it was a gamble written in torque and temperature, in the raw grammar of racing. The GP25 waited like an unbroken animal, its aluminum bones cold to the touch, asking one question: how much of yourself are you willing to spend for truth? We gripped the bar for the first time. The scar on his arm tightened as if memory itself resisted. He smiled under the hum of neon, feeling the pulse of the machine sync with his own. No cameras, no contracts, just a man daring physics to recognize him again. Somewhere between the sound of the starter and the first breath of fuel, he found the reason for every risk he had ever taken, not to win again, but to become whole enough to try. And so began the gamble, not against rivals or machines, but against destiny itself, as Marc Márquez turned his back on certainty to see whether the fire inside him could still outrun everything he'd left behind. Marc Márquez did the unthinkable. He dismantled his own legend with the calm precision of a man cutting the last rope to the shore, leaving behind a 25 million euro Honda contract that had defined him more than any title. For over a decade, he had been the pulse of Repsol's empire, the boy who bent physics until it whispered his name. Yet one morning, he simply exhaled and decided to stop breathing someone else's air. The boardrooms couldn't comprehend it, sponsors froze mid-sentence, and even the engineers who once read his heartbeat through data thought it was madness. But Márquez had seen the reflection of stagnation in the polished carbon of his RC213V and recognized fear disguised as loyalty. He packed silence into a suitcase and drove away from the factory gates without looking back. "I'm betting on myself again," he said, and the phrase detonated softly like truth breaking through static. Freedom for him wasn't champagne or headlines. It was the possibility of failure owned entirely by his own hands. He chose Gresini Ducati, a satellite team that promised nothing except the honesty of the stopwatch. Reporters laughed, calculating odds and percentages, but numbers have never understood hunger. That night in Faenza, under the buzz of a cheap neon bulb, he opened a notebook that still smelled of hospital disinfectant and oil. His handwriting shook, not from doubt but from rebirth as he wrote, "If I can't bend destiny, I'll bend the Ducati until it follows me." Outside, rain tapped on the workshop roof like a metronome, counting down to resurrection. He studied the naked frame of the GP23 and saw not metal, but possibility, an instrument waiting for new music. Sleep refused to come. Ambition whispered too loudly. In that insomnia, he rehearsed every curve he would someday dominate, every throttle pulse he would relearn with his scarred wrist. He imagined the faces of those who had doubted and felt an unfamiliar peace instead of anger. The choice had already rewritten him. Dawn found him still awake, eyes red but steady, as the first light slipped across the alloy surface of his future. Somewhere between exhaustion and faith, Marc Márquez understood that walking away wasn't loss. It was ignition. At turn 3, Jerez, the accelerometer spiked to 6 gs as his right arm snapped at 161 km per hour, a number that would forever echo between bone and memory. The sound of the fracture cut through the crowd's roar, raw and metallic, louder than disbelief itself. The bike tumbled beside him, a wounded animal grinding sparks into asphalt, while the world slowed to the speed of pain. Surgeons later inserted a titanium plate, sterile and perfect, but nothing could mend the silence that followed. In the antiseptic glow of the clinic, the smell of burnt rubber clung to his suit like the ghost of movement. Every beep of the monitor mocked him with its rhythm, steady, indifferent, mechanical. His body was suspended between morphine and regret, but his mind was wide awake, measuring the distance between who he was and who he might never be again. Honda's emails stopped arriving, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights that sounded suspiciously like abandonment. The engineers spoke of data, of torque, of telemetry, but never of trust. Each word unspoken weighed heavier than the cast around his arm. He scrolled through old race footage on a tablet, searching for the version of himself who believed he was indestructible. The man on the screen looked young, hungry, and impossibly distant. The real pain wasn't physical. It was silence, he whispered, and the echo filled the sterile room like confession. Outside, the city slept under rain that couldn't cool his fevered skin. Nights stretched long enough to measure in stitches rather than hours. Every throb of his arm felt like a metronome, counting the seconds of a career collapsing in slow motion. Yet beneath the despair, a spark refused to die, an ember hidden deep beneath the gauze. When dawn broke, the monitors blinked their indifference, and Marc Márquez opened his eyes not as a champion, but as a survivor. And survival, he realized, would demand more courage than any victory lap he had ever taken. Recovery became a ritual of isolation, calendar written in scars instead of days. The hospital lights blurred into one unbroken season where every hour smelled of disinfectant and failure. He endured 3 surgeries, endless physiotherapy, and sleepless nights studying telemetry from riders whose bodies still obeyed them. Pain became a language, each spasm a syllable of the story he refused to stop telling. When he returned to the paddock, he discovered his data erased from Honda's servers, replaced by Nakagami's like a gravestone where his name once shone. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear. Evolution had moved on without him. The factory corridors felt colder, echoes of laughter replaced by the mechanical hiss of machines that no longer knew his rhythm. He scrolled through the feedback files, hundreds of lines ignored, and realized that silence could be louder than a crash. Each day, he trained until his pulse drowned out doubt, measuring time not in podiums but in radiographs. Friends told him to rest, but rest felt like surrender. He walked the empty circuits at dawn, tracing the racing line with his fingertips as if trying to memorize belonging. Mirrors became interrogation rooms where he faced a stranger with the same eyes but none of the certainty. In that loneliness, something ancient awakened, a hunger older than pride. Change everything or never race again, he confessed to himself, and the words didn't sound like despair, they sounded like ignition. From that day, he stopped fearing defeat and began fearing stagnation, the slow death of repetition. He studied rivals' telemetry until every decimal became a prophecy. His scarred arm trembled over the throttle, but defiance steadied the hand. The roar of the engine in simulations was no longer noise. It was heartbeat, identity, proof of continuation. Nights turned into blueprints, pain into data, and failure into raw material. When dawn finally arrived, Marc Márquez understood that resurrection doesn't begin with victory. It begins when the world stops believing you can rise, and you rise anyway. On January 14, 2024, Marc Márquez sat before the glow of a laptop screen and digitally signed away a fortune, each click severing another artery that had once fed his legend. The document was clinical and different, yet behind every line hid a decade of victories, surgeries, and silences. He forfeited millions without hesitation, because currency had stopped buying meaning long ago. Freedom had a price, but as he said later, freedom has a cost, but obedience costs the soul. That single sentence felt like an exhale after years of suffocation. The world called it madness, but he called it clarity. The morning air in Cervera tasted metallic, as if even oxygen carried the residue of machinery he no longer wanted to serve. He crossed the Pyrenees in a van filled with gear that still smelled of Repsol fuel and ghosts. The mountains loomed like judges, silent and watchful, yet he drove through them with the calm of a man who had already faced worse storms inside his own chest. When he reached Faenza, Davide Tardozzi greeted him with a handshake that was both challenge and invitation. "I can't promise a stage, but I offer you a laboratory," the Ducati manager said, and the phrase slid into Márquez's mind like prophecy. That line would echo through every corridor he later filled with noise and risk. The garage smelled of coffee, rubber, and rebirth. The GP23 waited there, unpainted, raw, almost breathing, and he touched its aluminum frame as if to verify that redemption had a texture. It was colder than he expected, but the chill steadied him. For the first time in years, there was no marketing department scripting his next word. He was no longer an ambassador, he was a craftsman. Outside, the rain began to fall in thin diagonal lines, each drop marking a clean page in the notebook of his future. He wrote one sentence before sleeping, his handwriting crooked but certain: "If I can't bend destiny, I'll bend the Ducati until it follows me." And with that promise, he closed the book and finally rested, not as an idol, but as a man reborn through the courage of departure. Sepping woke under a silver dawn. the humid air trembling with the first roar of the GP25 as Marc Márquez rolled it from the garage like a weapon reborn. The bike shimmered with possibility, leaner, faster, a blade honed from the lessons of every scar he carried. The first laps carved through the Malaysian heat with 3 km/h more top speed, sharper aerodynamics, and a stability sculpted directly by his feedback. Each curve of its carbon skin was a translation of his defiance into design. The paddock watched in silence, half awe, half disbelief, as he merged calculation with instinct. He removed the filters, both mechanical and psychological, until only the essence of control remained. "Give me the same map and race without filters," he told his engineers, and the command sounded less like a request than a manifesto. The Ducati answered with a howl that seemed to remember pain. He rode differently now, smoother, deliberate, the rage replaced by something far more dangerous: patience. Every vibration under the seat was a verse in a meditation written at 200 km/h. He had learned to read the track not as an adversary, but as an ancient text revealing its secrets one corner at a time. Even his injuries had become teachers. The wrist that once betrayed him now dictated the rhythm of restraint. Sweat traced lines down his neck, salt meeting steel, and he smiled inside the helmet, unseen, uncelebrated it. Around him, Sepping's asphalt shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting both history and hunger. When he braked, it wasn't fear that slowed him, but precision, the mathematics of survival rewritten into art. He began to understand that real power isn't dominance. It's discipline disguised as serenity. Between each run, he wrote notes that were more like prayers than analysis. Instinct is a muscle to be trained, he reminded himself, and the words became his new creed. By sunset, the GP25 stood idle, steaming softly in the twilight, while Márquez walked away not as a man chasing redemption, but as one who had already found it in the quiet pulse of control. The 2025 season unfolded like a quiet storm, and Marc Márquez stood at its center, no longer the reckless comet, but the controlled orbit that pulled everything toward him. Victories in Lusail, Portimao, Austin, Mugello, and Jerez reminded the world that talent ages slower than fear, that instinct doesn't retire, it refines. Yet those triumphs carried a different rhythm, a heartbeat measured not in desperation but in deliberate precision. Gone was the rider who once danced with danger, simply to feel alive. In his place stood a strategist, a man who had learned that the sharpest blade cuts slowest. Every lap became a conversation between risk and reason. He no longer hunted chaos, he choreographed it. Engineers noted his telemetry lines were cleaner, smoother, almost surgical, as if each apex were drawn with ink instead of rubber. He spoke less in briefings and listened more, dissecting data the way monks read scripture. His new creed was carved not in celebration but in restraint. 0 crashes in 4 weekends, the cleanest run of his career. Speed is truth. Management is wisdom. "Now I possess both," he wrote after Misano, and the phrase carried the quiet weight of revelation. The paddock sensed it too. The fury had not vanished. It had matured, compressed into a stillness that frightened rivals more than his aggression ever had. Every throttle input was now philosophy rendered in motion. Each overtaking maneuver carried the elegance of inevitability rather than impulse. The grandstands still roared his name, but he no longer raced to silence them. He raced to understand himself within their echo. The Ducati beneath him wasn't a machine. It was a mirror, reflecting the balance between instinct and intellect. For the first time, he didn't feel pursued by his own legend. Instead, he walked beside it, unafraid of the shadow it cast. And in that measured stride, Marc Márquez discovered that victory without chaos is not dullness. It is enlightenment disguised as speed. Success, when it burns too brightly, casts shadows even in the most triumphant garages, and by mid-season Ducati was learning that truth through Marc Márquez. His rise had redrawn the hierarchy inside Borgo Panigale's red walls, shifting gravity toward his side of the box until every engineer seemed to orbit the number 93. The GP25, shaped around his precise, almost obsessive feedback, had become an extension of his instincts, a machine fluent in his pulse but foreign to others. Pecco Bagnaia, once the factory's anchor, felt his confidence eroding lap by lap, each data comparison a quiet humiliation. Marco Bezzecchi, now on Aprilia yet emotionally tethered to his old camp, watched from afar as whispers grew louder in the paddock corridors. They said Ducati had built a god and forgotten the congregation. Meetings stretched late into the night, the language of innovation replaced by the grammar of caution. Some executives proposed to freeze development, fearing that perfection, once touched, could only fracture. Márquez listened to none of it. His focus was carved in a smaller, more sacred space, the gap between throttle and traction. When journalists asked if he felt guilty for unbalancing the empire, he laughed softly, eyes distant, and replied, "With me, perfection is always precarious." The quote became a prophecy, printed on posters, muttered by rivals, dissected by analysts who couldn't measure serenity in telemetry. Behind the curtain of dominance, the political engine hummed. Bagnaia defending legacy, engineers defending logic, Márquez defending evolution itself. He remained polite, detached, a man too aware that success breeds unrest faster than failure. In team briefings, his silence carried more authority than any directive from management. The Ducati garage, once a cathedral of unity, now vibrated with the nervous harmony of suppressed ambition. Mechanics traded glances instead of words, fearful that the smallest adjustment might tilt the balance of history. Yet Márquez kept scoring, relentless and emotionless, his 126-point lead a monument built on both brilliance and collateral damage. Beneath the red floodlights, the GP25 glowed like a weapon forged by too many hands. In that radiance, Marc rode alone, not out of arrogance, but because solitude had become the only speed he trusted. When Marco Bezzecchi crossed from Ducati's orbit to Aprilia's lean factory in 2025, few expected the chemistry to ignite as violently as it did. The RSGP responded to his raw aggression like flint to steel, translating recklessness into rhythm, rebellion into lap time. Within 3 races, he was hunting Márquez on equal terms, carving through corners with a looseness that looked like chaos until you read the stopwatch. Fire met ice, youth met scar tissue, and MotoGP found its new heartbeat. Every duel between them rewrote the geometry of courage. One attacked lines that physics forbade, the other dissolved limits through calculation. Commentators spoke of eras colliding, but it felt more intimate, 2 philosophies staring into each other's mirrors. Bezzecchi's Aprilia twitched and danced, a storm barely contained, while Márquez's Ducati glided with the poise of a surgeon. The tension wasn't hatred but magnetism, the inevitable pull of opposites. Fans painted grandstands half black, half red, their chants blending into a single roar of anticipation. When asked about the rivalry, Márquez smiled behind the visor and said, "I don't look for enemies, I look for my limit." The quote traveled faster than telemetry, instantly immortalized on banners and broadcasts. Bezzechi grinned when told, answering only with another reckless lunge at the next race. Their battles became theater, fearless, technical, poetic, each lap a stanza in a duel that made the world forget politics and remember purity. Team managers watched nervously, knowing one misstep could cost millions, but neither rider seemed to care. The mutual respect between them was the quiet engine beneath the spectacle. Márquez began studying Bezzecchi's throttle patterns, seeing reflections of his younger self. Bezzecchi, in turn, adopted fragments of Marc's discipline without realizing it. Together they defined the sport's evolution: instinct versus intellect, fire versus ice, chaos versus control. And as the season deepened, every time their trajectories crossed, the track itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that rivalry, when born of admiration, burns longer than victory. The sun over Mandalika shimmered against the tarmac like liquid glass when fate decided to intervene at turn 10. Marco Bezzecchi, chasing the scent of victory, lunged half a heartbeat too late, and physics, as always, punished hesitation. Contact sparked like flint against steel, and Marc Márquez was thrown skyward, a crimson arc of flesh and carbon slicing through the Indonesian air. The crowd gasped before sound itself caught up. The Ducati tumbled violently, scattering fragments of paint and pride, while Marc hit the asphalt shoulder first with a crack that silence immediately devoured. The medical team rushed in, yet even through the haze of adrenaline, he already knew the verdict: fractured clavicle, torn ligaments, another scar for a body written entirely in them. Bezzecchi crossed the line to win, but celebration wilted into guilt as race control reviewed the footage frame by frame. The verdict came swift, penalty applied, victory questioned, conscience heavy. In a sterile hospital room filled with monitors that blinked like distant applause, Márquez stared at the ceiling and posted 5 words that disarmed the storm: "Pain passes. Lessons stay." The message spread faster than the crash replay, a hymn of dignity in a sport built on danger. For 6 weeks, he vanished from the grid, trading apexes for physiotherapy, endurance for introspection. Every movement of his shoulder was a negotiation between suffering and stubbornness. He returned to the paddock still bandaged, his gait uneven, but his gaze unbroken. Cameras swarmed, microphones thirsted for anger, but he gave them grace instead. We all take the same risks. That's what makes this sport pure. No accusation, no bitterness, only understanding forged in shared peril. The paddock fell silent, recognizing strength greater than victory. Bezzechi sought him afterward, but words failed, a nod sufficed. The rivalry that once burned hot now cooled into mutual respect, tempered by asphalt and empathy. From pain, Márquez distilled a truth rarer than triumph, that the courage to forgive is the final evolution of a racer. The sun over Motorland Aragon burned white and merciless, baking the circuit until every shimmer of heat seemed to test resolve as much as rubber. Marc Márquez, body still stitched from Mandalika's violence, rolled his GP25 to the grid with a quiet that spoke louder than adrenaline. He knew the mathematics, third place would be enough, but arithmetic had never been the engine of his heart. The race unfolded like a meditation on pain and persistence, smooth, deliberate, void of excess, every lap a measured argument against fragility. His shoulder throbbed, his wrist whispered rebellion, yet his focus held absolute, an old cathedral rebuilt one apex at a time. When the checkered flag dropped, he crossed the line third, and in that fraction of a second the world recalibrated its idea of triumph. The 2025 World Championship was his, carved not from dominance but endurance. He lifted his helmet, eyes bright with exhaustion and pride, and said through cracked lips, "I bet on myself. I lost a lot, but I found much more." Mechanics wept behind visors as he placed his titanium plate, the one once bolted inside his arm, on the pit wall. The metal that had held him together now symbolized unity, a trophy made of both pain and persistence. Cameras flashed, recording not celebration but catharsis. That night, amid the clatter of wrenches and laughter softened by disbelief, his phone buzzed with a message from Valentino Rossi. "Red suits you. See you on track." For a moment, time folded, past rivalry dissolving into mutual recognition. Marc smiled, the kind of smile that carries both gratitude and release. He sat by the window of his motorhome, the desert wind brushing against the curtains like applause fading into memory. The championship trophy gleamed beside him, but his gaze lingered on the shadows it cast. He opened his notebook, its pages heavy with ink and consequence, and wrote the last line of his season. "The future begins when you share your shadow with those who walk beside you." Then he closed it gently, knowing that some victories are not measured in points, but in peace. "If the body demands patience, I'll teach the mind to listen." Those words became the quiet gospel of Marc Márquez's resurrection, the sentence that turned from whisper to engine note every time he climbed back on the bike. His story has outgrown the stopwatch. It now lives in the narrow space where endurance becomes philosophy. Once defined by speed, he has become the architect of rhythm, reshaping pain into geometry, fear into calculation, and victory into understanding. The GP25 beneath him is more than machinery. It is a mirror polished by suffering, reflecting a man who learned that strength is not the absence of weakness but the mastery of it. Every scar has evolved into a signature, every fracture into a line of scripture written on bone. He no longer rides to prove he is faster. He rides to prove he can begin again endlessly with grace. Each lap is an act of remembrance and rebellion, a promise that courage can be quiet and still shake the earth. Around him, rivals chase records, but Márquez chases equilibrium, the perfect balance between motion and meaning. He has turned agony into discipline, solitude into focus, risk into language. When the visor lowers, it seals not arrogance but awareness, the knowledge that a legend's truest speed is measured in recovery, not acceleration. His victories now move slower, deeper, closer to truth. And in every heartbeat that hums beneath the red fairing, he reminds the world that betting on yourself is the hardest, purest form of faith disguised as velocity.